I'm Mike Oliver, and I was the first Professor of Disability Studies in the United Kingdom, and for my sins, while I didn't invent the social model of disability, I am responsible for naming it. The basic idea behind the social model of disability emerged from a document published in 1976 by the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation, and that turned on its head our understandings of disability, because it suggested that the problems that disabled people faced were not caused by our impairments, but were caused by the way in which society failed to organise itself in a way which allowed disabled people to be included. So it changed from being a medical issue to a human rights issue almost overnight. And when I first read this, it was obvious that it was an idea of fundamental importance, because it was basically giving you the opportunity, both personally and politically, to rethink about yourself and your position in society. About 3 years later, I was appointed to teach a course for professional social workers and occupational therapists, a master's course in disability studies, as we would call it today. And I wanted the central idea behind that course to be the fundamental principles idea that it's society that disables us, not our impairments. And so I developed this thing called the social model of disability, which initially was intended to be a tool to enable the students that I was encountering, the professional students that I was encountering, to understand and to work in different ways with disabled people. But it took on a whole new life after that. When it came out in a book in 1983, the social model simply took off. Disabled people who were by then beginning to collectively organise saw it as almost like their mantra for going forward politically. And so it was very important for our collective political consciousness that we had a kind of almost like a slogan to say, so when government ministers or organisations said, tell us what you want, we want your services to be organised around the social model of disability, was a very quick and easy shorthand way to say that. But of course it's not just liberating in a political sense of the word, it's also liberating in a personal sense, because I mean I have been disabled since 1962, and for the first 15 years of my life as a disabled person, I took on personal responsibility for the consequences of my impairment. So for example, when I became an undergraduate student in 1972, the university I went to was completely inaccessible. But I thought that was my responsibility. So I spent 3 years being lifted up and down 4 flights of stairs in the various colleges, not having access to the whole range of services that other students had simply because they weren't accessible and so on. But I always thought that was my fault. It was entirely my responsibility to organise my life in ways that would enable me to complete my degree. But by the time the Fundamental Principles document came out in '76, I was a postgraduate, and I was beginning to think, both personally but also collectively, because there were a number of organisations controlled by disabled people developing at that time. So both individually and collectively, I began to say, this isn't good enough, this isn't enough. It is not me that has to change, it's universities. The problem isn't that I can't get into a lecture theatre, the problem is that the lecture theatre isn't accessible to me, and that gives a whole different basis on which to argue politically with the authorities on campus about how disabled students should be accommodated on campus. But of course it's not just about ramps, it's about information. How is information provided? It's about how is the curriculum delivered. It's about what kind of rules and regulations do courses have in terms of making allowances for the barriers that disabled students are facing. So the social model is potentially liberating, both individually and collectively, for people who want to rethink their own lives or organise collectively to improve the lives that they're currently having. But of course, since it took off 30 years ago, it's not been without its critics. The two main criticisms are, one, that the social model doesn't take account of the experiences of impairment. In other words, as disabled people, we do have medical consequences and so on. We do have, sometimes we feel pretty shitty about ourselves and our lives. Sometimes we're ill, just like non-disabled people. But the social model was never designed to do that. And the second argument that the social model has been criticised for is that it doesn't really take account of all of the individual issues that people face, and quite often people want to talk about themselves. Now, my argument always has been the social model is not some kind of all-encompassing theory which will explain everything that's happens to your life, both personally and politically and economically and socially. All the social model is a tool. If you were wanting to put a picture on a wall, you would use a hammer to bang the nail in. If you wanted to build a bookcase, you'd have a screwdriver to screw the screws into the wood for the bookcase. So that's all the social model is. It's a tool. If it's of any use to you, use it. If it's of no use, then discard it and find something else. Don't spend 20 or 30 years of your life criticising it and saying, well, this doesn't do what I want it to do for me, because that's not what it's about. It's a hammer or a screwdriver. It's nothing more or nothing less. So to finish, really, my argument would be use it or lose it.